Long before the word France was spoken, before the rhythm of church bells or the rustle of silk in Versailles, there were deep forests and wide rivers running cold from the mountains. In caves like those at Lascaux, flickering torchlight revealed paintings of bison, deer, and wild horses, images so vivid you can almost hear their hooves pounding over the earth. These walls are silent now, but once they held voices murmuring in the half-dark, the smell of smoke curling upward. These were the Magdalenian people, artists and hunters, who left their stories in ochre and charcoal tens of thousands of years before Paris would rise. In their world, the seasons ruled, winters sharp and white, summers heavy with the scent of pine and wildflowers. As millennia passed, these small bands gave way to more settled tribes. By the Neolithic period, the people here had learned to coax wheat and barley from the soil, to pen sheep and cattle in wooden enclosures, to shape clay into pots for storing grain. The mornings would have been quiet, except for the lowing of animals, the crack of kindling, the rhythmic thud of stone grinding against stone to make flour. These early farmers built villages from timber and thatch, the smoke from their fires drifting in blue columns into the sky. Over time, they raised great standing stonesmen-heers and dolmen silent sentinels whose purposes are still partly a mystery, aligned with the stars and the turning of the sun. By the first millennium BCE, the land we now know as France was home to the Celtic Gauls, fierce and inventive. Their hair sometimes lime-washed into stiff pale spikes, their cloaks bright with dyes, their jewelry heavy with bronze and gold. Villages were often fortified, ringed with wooden palisades, and life revolved around farming, smithing, and trading. They brewed mead, hunted wild boar, and met in great wooden halls where chieftains feasted their warriors. Religion was woven into every part of life. Druids tended sacred groves, memorized long histories, and oversaw rituals beside rivers or in forest clearings. The Gauls were skilled metalworkers. Their swords and shields carried far beyond their borders, traded for amber, salt, and fine pottery. They minted coins stamped with intricate designs, spirals, animals, human faces each, a small promise of the wealth and craft of their people. Their society was divided into classes: warriors, druids, and common folk, with alliances and rivalries shifting constantly among tribes. It was a vibrant world, rich in custom and pride, but it was also one that would soon be tested by a power unlike any they had faced before. In 58 BCE, the sound of marching legions began to echo through Gaul's valleys. The Romans, under Julius Caesar, were expanding their empire, and the fertile lands of the Gauls lay directly in their path. At first, the Romans were met with resistance tribes uniting under leaders like Vercingetorix, whose name would be carried through centuries as a symbol of defiance. In the hilltop stronghold of Gergovia, Gaulish warriors repelled Roman assaults, their horns sounding across the ridges, their spears flashing in the sun. But the tide turned at Alesia in 52 BCE, where Caesar's forces encircled the defenders with walls and trenches, cutting them off from reinforcements. Hunger, cold, and relentless attack forced surrender. And with it, Gaul's independence slipped away. The Roman era reshaped everything. Roads of stone cut across the countryside, carrying soldiers, merchants, and ideas. Towns grew into cities: Lutetia, modern Paris; Lugdunum, Lyon, and Massilia, Marseille, each with forums, baths, aqueducts, and amphitheaters where crowds gathered to watch gladiators or listen to orators. Villas dotted the countryside, their mosaic floors cool underfoot, their courtyards shaded by colonnades. Latin became the language of administration, trade, and law, slowly blending with local tongues to form the seeds of what would one day become French. Under Roman rule, Gaul became a vital part of the empire's network. Its farms fed legions. Its wine and ceramics traveled to distant provinces. Education flourished in certain cities, and Roman religion mingled with Celtic traditions. Jupiter alongside Tyrannus, Mercury alongside Lugus. In the evenings, oil lamps lit the streets, and the air was filled with a scent of baking bread, roasting meat, and incense burning in household shrines. But the empire's peace was never absolute. Along the northern frontiers, pressure from migrating tribes grew year by year, and whispers of unrest began to reach even the quietest villas. By the 3rd century CE, cracks were showing. Roman Gaul faced invasions from Germanic tribes like the Franks, Alemanni, and Visigoths. Fortified walls rose around cities, and legions were stretched thin. Trade slowed, villas fell into disrepair, and many rural estates were abandoned. The once solid thread of Roman order began to fray. And as the empire's heart faltered, Gaul stood on the edge of transformation once again. When the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed in the late 5th century, the land was left to new rulers' tribes who would carry both the legacy of Rome and their own fierce traditions into the centuries ahead. It is here, in the stillness after the empire's fall, that the air seems to change. The marble columns stand cracked and empty, but the rivers still flow, and the forests still whisper. In the distance, a new name is beginning to be spoken. The Franks, from whom France will take its name. And with them, the next chapter begins. The Roman roads still lay across the land like pale scars, but now they carried riders in mail and cloaks of wool, banners bearing new emblems, snapping in the wind. The Franks regionally, a confederation of Germanic tribes, had moved into Gaul as both conquerors and inheritors. They settled among Roman ruins, taking over villas, fortifying towns, and planting themselves in the fertile valleys. Their leaders carried Roman titles, but spoke in their own tongue, a language that would blend over centuries with the remnants of Latin. At the heart of this transformation was a young king named Clovis, whose reign would shape the destiny of this land for centuries to come. Clovis, crowned king of the Franks in 481 CE, was ambitious and relentless. He expanded his realm through alliances, marriages, and decisive battles, defeating rival tribes and uniting the Franks under one crown. But his most enduring act was his conversion to Christianity event. That, legend says, followed a desperate prayer before victory at the Battle of Tolbiac. Baptized in Reims around 496 CE, he brought not only himself but thousands of his warriors into the Catholic faith, aligning his kingdom with the powerful Church of Rome. This bond between crown and altar would endure, shaping French politics, culture, and identity for more than a millennium. The Merovingian dynasty that followed Clovis ruled from a series of royal centers, often moving with the seasons. Their court, a mix of Roman administrative habits and Frankish warrior customs. Long-haired kings, as they were called, were symbols of sacred authority. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his right to rule. Their queens, often politically astute, played roles in diplomacy and governance, weaving networks of influence that extended across Europe. Yet over time, real power began to drift from the kings themselves to their chief officials, the mayors of the palace, who managed the realm's day-to-day affairs. By the 8th century, one such mayor, Charles Martel, the Hammer, would leave his mark not just on France, but on European history. In 732, at the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, Charles and his Frankish forces halted an advancing Muslim army from the Iberian Peninsula, a victory that would later be framed as a turning point in the defense of Christian Europe. In reality, it was one battle among many in a complex web of alliances and conflicts. But its symbolic weight would echo in chronicles for centuries. Charles Martel's descendants, the Carolingians, would take the Frankish throne entirely. His grandson, Charlemagne Charles the Great, was crowned king of the Franks in 768 and quickly set about expanding his empire. Charlemagne's reign became a golden chapter in medieval history. He wove together vast territories from the Pyrenees to the Danube, brought scholars to his court at Aachen, and initiated what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, art, and law. His scribes developed a clear, uniform script, Carolingian minuscule, that would influence European writing for centuries. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the Grand Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Charlemagne knelt in prayer before the altar. Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head, declaring him Emperor of the Romans. The moment symbolized the fusion of Roman legacy, Christian faith, and Germanic kingship, a trinity that would underpin medieval France. Yet, even this vast empire could not withstand the weight of succession disputes. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his heirs divided the realm, and the Treaty of Verdun in 843 carved it into three parts. The western portion, West Francia, would become the foundation of modern France. The centuries that followed were restless ones. Viking longships began appearing along the coasts and rivers, their shallow hulls allowing them to sail inland to raid monasteries, towns, and trade routes. The people of West Francia learned to live in a constant state of readiness, fortifying settlements, paying tribute, and building stone keeps to guard river crossings. One Viking leader, Rollo, was granted land along the lower Seine in 911 in exchange for his loyalty. This region became Normandy, whose dukes would one day play decisive roles in France's fate. Meanwhile, feudalism began to take root. With central authority weakened, local lords became the primary source of protection and governance. Castles rose on hilltops, their stone walls looming over villages and fields. In return for safety, peasants worked the land, their lives marked by the rhythms of planting and harvest, by tolling bells and seasonal fairs. The church, ever present, built monasteries and cathedrals that became both spiritual centers and keepers of knowledge, where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight. The Capetian dynasty began in 987 with the election of Hugh Capet as king, a choice made by a handful of powerful nobles seeking a ruler who would not threaten their autonomy. Hugh's realm was modest, little more than the Isle de France around Paris, but over the next 3 centuries, his descendants expanded royal influence through careful marriages, wars, and diplomacy. Under the Capetians, the French monarchy began the slow transformation from a fragile kingship to a more centralized authority. Life in medieval France was layered and complex. In bustling market towns, traders sold wine from Bordeaux, salt from the Atlantic coast, fine cloth from Flanders, and spices brought overland from the east. Pilgrims walked the long road to Santiago de Compostela, their scallop shells clinking as they passed through villages. Troubadours sang in Occitan of courtly love, knights swore oaths of chivalry, and the scent of roasting meat and beeswax candles drifted from castle halls during feasts. Yet, beyond these scenes of color and pageantry, there was hardships. Poor harvests could bring famine, and outbreaks of disease, such as the plague, swept through with devastating effect. By the dawn of the High Middle Ages, France was a land of contrasts. Feudal fragmentation alongside growing royal ambition. Rich cultural life alongside deep rural poverty. But the stage was set for the great struggles to come, conflicts that would pit France against its neighbors and even test the authority of its own kings. The most famous of these would erupt over the English crown in a war that lasted more than a century, a war that would see not only destruction but the rise of a young woman whose name would echo through the ages, Jeanne d'Arc. The early 14th century found France as one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Yet its royal succession was soon entangled in a dynastic dispute that would ignite a conflict stretching over a century. When the Capetian King Charles IV died in 1328 without a direct male heir, the question arose: could the crown pass through a female line? The French nobility declared it could not, invoking Salic law, which excluded women from the succession. This denied the claim of Edward III of England, whose mother was Charles IV's sister, and instead placed Philip VI of Valois on the throne. Edward, however, saw this as an affront to his rights, and thus began the 100 Years' War, a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities spanning from 1337 to 1453. The first phase of the war brought humiliation to France. The English, masters of the longbow, won stunning victories at in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, where the French king, John II, was captured and taken to London. These defeats were compounded by the arrival of the Black Death in 1347 to 1351, which devastated the population, killing perhaps a third of all French people. Fields went untilled. Villages were abandoned, and the once crowded markets fell silent under the weight of loss. By the mid-14th century, France was a land of fragmented power. While the Valois monarchy struggled to reassert control, roaming bands of mercenaries, known as free companies, plundered the countryside during lulls in the fighting. Peasant uprisings, such as the Jacquerie of 1358, erupted in protest against heavy taxation and feudal oppression, only to be crushed with brutal force. Yet, even in these grim years, there were moments of resilience. Cities fortified themselves. Trade slowly revived, and the church bells still called the faithful to worship. The war's second phase shifted the advantage toward France, thanks in part to the leadership of King Charles V, known as the Wise. With his skilled constable Bertrand du Guesclin, Charles avoided pitched battles and relied on sieges and strategic retreats to reclaim territory. By the time of his death in 1380, much of the land lost to the English had been recovered. Yet his successor, Charles VI, would plunge the kingdom into crisis through war alone, but through his own mental illness. Periodic bouts of insanity left him unfit to rule, leading to fierce rivalries among the nobility, particularly between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions. It was into this fractured realm that Henry V of England marched in 1415, leading to the legendary Battle of Agincourt. Outnumbered and bogged down in mud, the French knights charged recklessly into the English archers' withering fire. The result was a catastrophic defeat, and the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin, Charles, the son of the Mad King. Yet, history would not follow the treaty's script, for, in 1429, an extraordinary figure emerged from the small village of a teenage peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc. Claiming to be guided by divine visions, she persuaded the Dauphin to let her lead an army to relieve the besieged city of. Against all expectation, the French forces won a decisive victory, and within months, Charles was crowned Charles VII in Reims, fulfilling one of Jeanne's prophecies. Her presence on the battlefield was as much spiritual as strategic. She carried a banner, not a sword, and inspired troops with her unwavering faith. But her rise was swift, and her fall cruel. Captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, she was sold to the English, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431, at the age of 19. Her death was meant to break French morale, yet it only deepened her legend. Over the next 2 decades, Charles VII reasserted royal authority, reformed the army, and, with the use of artillery, a relatively new weapon in siege warfare, drove the English out of all French territories, except Calais, by 1453. The 100 Years' War left France battered, but also transformed. Feudal levies gave way to a standing army under the king's command. Taxation became more organized, and the sense of a shared French identity grew stronger. Yet the scars of the conflict ran deep. Towns still bore burn marks from sieges. Farmlands lay fallow, and entire generations had known nothing but war. Still, the Valois kings emerged with a stronger hold over their realm, setting the stage for both a cultural flowering and new political ambitions in the century to follow. The mid-15th century in France opened not just with the end of the 100 Years' War, but with the slow rebuilding of a fractured kingdom. Charles VII, now secure on the throne, turned his energies toward reform. He standardized coinage, reinforced the power of the monarchy over regional nobles, and continued developing the permanent standing army that had proved so decisive against the English. The scars of war were still fresh fields, reclaimed from weeds. Bridges rebuilt plank by plank, but a sense of cautious optimism returned. Paris, though diminished, began once more to hum with markets and craftsmen. In the Loire Valley, castles once built for defense started transforming into graceful chateaux, symbols of a court turning its gaze from war to refinement. When Louis XI, the Spider King, succeeded his father in 1461, he wove a web of diplomacy, intrigue, and calculated marriages to further centralize royal power. Though unpopular among some nobles for his cunning and often ruthless tactics, Louis expanded the authority of the crown and integrated Burgundy into the French realm after the death of Charles the Bold in 1477, a territorial gain that would shape France's borders for centuries. France stood poised to participate in the cultural and intellectual movement sweeping Europe, the Renaissance. It was under Francis I, 1547, that the Renaissance reached its French zenith, a patron of the arts and a rival of both Henry VIII of England and Charles V of Spain. Francis brought Italian artists and architects to his court, including Leonardo da Vinci, who spent his final years in Angers, bringing with him works like the Mona Lisa. French literature flourished through poets like Rabelais and Du Bellay, who infused their works with humanist ideals. The chateaux of the Loire became masterpieces of symmetry and ornamentation, blending Gothic elegance with Renaissance harmony. But the Renaissance also carried with it religious upheaval. The spread of Protestant ideas inspired Martin Luther's Reformation, began to take root in France in the 1520s, particularly among the nobility and urban elites. These French Protestants, known as Huguenots, challenged the Catholic orthodoxy that had long underpinned the monarchy. Francis I initially tolerated some reformist thinkers, but reversed course after acts of Protestant defiance, such as the affair of the placards in 1534, when anti-Catholic posters appeared in Paris and even on the king's bedchamber door. The crackdown began. Huguenots were arrested, tortured, and burned at the stake. Under Francis's successors, his son Henry II, and later Henry's 3 sons, all of whom would die without producing strong heirs, the conflict between Catholics and Huguenots spiraled into open violence. The Wars of Religion, 1562 to 1598, were marked by assassinations, massacres, and shifting alliances, often with foreign powers meddling in France's affairs. One of the most notorious events was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 24, 1572, when thousands of Huguenots gathered in Paris for the wedding of the Protestant Henry of Navarre to the Catholic Margaret of Valois were slaughtered in the streets. What began as targeted assassinations of Protestant leaders devolved into days of mob violence across the city and soon spread to the provinces, leaving tens of thousands dead. The wars dragged on through the reign of the last Valois king, Henry III, whose assassination in 1589 brought Henry of Navarre, leader of the Huguenots, and now heir by distant blood, to the throne as Henry IV. Yet the Catholic League, backed by Spain, refused to accept a Protestant king. In a gesture both pragmatic and symbolic, Henry converted to Catholicism in 1593, reportedly remarking, "Paris is worth a mass." His accession and conversion paved the way for the Edict of Nuns in 1598, which granted substantial religious freedoms to the Huguenots while reaffirming Catholicism as the state religion. It was a rare moment of compromise in an age when religious tolerance was scarce, and it ended more than 3 decades of bloodshed. Henry I's reign also marked a turning point toward stability and prosperity. He encouraged agriculture, repaired roads, and fostered trade. The Seine and Loire carried goods once more. Towns rebuilt their walls, not for defense, but to delineate their growing boundaries. The king's assassination in 1610 by a fanatic Catholic, however, was a grim reminder of how fragile that peace remained. His young son, Louis XIII, inherited the throne, ushering in the Bourbon dynasty's full ascendancy, and the rise of one of France's most famous statesmen, Cardinal Richelieu, who would shape the country's destiny in the century to come. When Louis XIII took the throne in 1610, he was just 9 years old, and governance fell largely to his mother, Marie de Medici, as regent. Her court was filled with Italian advisors and lavish spending, drawing resentment from the French nobility. In 1617, the young king, now asserting his authority, had his mother's favorite, Concini, assassinated, effectively exiling her from political influence. But Louis's reign truly took shape under the guidance of Cardinal Richelieu, appointed chief minister in 1624. Richelieu was a man of cold calculation, political genius, and unwavering dedication to the idea of a strong, centralized monarchy. He curbed the power of the nobility, demolished many of their fortified castles, and suppressed Huguenot political autonomy, while still maintaining their right to worship. His famous siege of La Rochelle in 1627 broke the backbone of Protestant resistance. Richelieu also placed France firmly on the European stage, involving the kingdom in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. On the side of Protestant states, not out of religious solidarity, but to counterbalance the power of the Habsburgs in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. French troops marched across Germany, while at home, Richelieu's policies strengthened royal authority and the administrative network of intendants royal officials who oversaw provinces, ensuring the king's will reached every corner of the realm. By the time Richelieu died in 1642, and Louis XIII the following year, the framework of absolutist monarchy was firmly established. The transition to Louis XIV's reign was turbulent. The young king, only 5 years old in 1643, left governance in the hands of his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. During Mazarin's tenure, France was embroiled in the final years of the 30 Years' War, which ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, granting France valuable territories like Alsace. But domestically, unrest brewed. The Fronde, 1648 to 1653. A series of civil wars involving nobles, the Paris Parliament, and other factions, challenged royal authority and brought the royal family into direct conflict with the people of Paris. Louis, as a child, experienced the chaos firsthand at one point. Hostile crowds even invaded his palace chambers. This early trauma left a lasting impression, convincing him that only unchallenged royal power could preserve stability. When Mazarin died in 1661, the 22-year-old Louis XIV shocked his court by announcing that he would rule without a chief ministering, unprecedented move in recent French history. Under Louis XIV, France became the cultural heart of Europe. The Franquets regulated the French language, while playwrights like Racine and Corneille elevated French drama to unmatched heights. Baroque architecture flourished, and fashion trends from Versailles spread across the continent. The Sun King also sought military glory, waging a series of wars of devolution 1667, 1666, 1670, 167, 1678, War of the Reunions 1683 to 1684, and the Long War of the League of Augsburg 1697, that expanded France's borders and reinforced its position as Europe's dominant power. His armies, the largest and most professional of their time, marched under generals like Turenne, and feared and admired in equal measure. Yet Louis's reign was not without controversy or hardship. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes with the Edict of Fontainebleau, outlawing Protestantism and forcing hundreds of thousands of Huguenots to flee France, many of them skilled artisans and merchants. This decision, intended to strengthen religious unity, ultimately harmed the economy and deprived France of valuable talent. The later years of his reign were dominated by the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, a costly conflict fought to secure his grandson Philip V's right to the Spanish throne. Although France eventually achieved a favorable settlement in the Treaty of Utrecht, the war drained the treasury and inflicted great suffering on the population. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, the Sun King had left behind a France both glorious and strained, a land of unmatched cultural prestige and military reputation, but also deep debts, heavy taxation, and social inequalities that would fester in the centuries to come. His great-grandson, Louis XV, would inherit a kingdom where the absolute monarchy's grandeur masked underlying tensions that no amount of gold or ceremony could fully conceal. Louis XV ascended the throne in 1715 at the tender age of 5 under the regency of Philippe, the Duke of whose early governance sought to balance the enormous debt left by Louis XIV with a more flexible and consultative style, even attempting to decentralize authority by restoring some powers to the parliaments. But financial woes persisted. The infamous Mississippi Bubble, orchestrated by the Scottish economist John Law, promised vast wealth through colonial ventures in Louisiana, but collapsed spectacularly in 1720, ruining investors and shattering public trust in the monarchy's economic judgment. By the time Louis XV took personal control in 1723, and the young king's early popularity would slowly erode over decades of mixed governance, Louis XV was charming, handsome, and at first eager to emulate his great-grandfather's glory. But he was less disciplined and more influenced by court factions and personal relationships. His reign saw France embroiled in complex European diplomacy, particularly through the War of the Polish Succession 1733-1738 and the War of the Austrian Succession 1740-1748, conflicts that brought some territorial gains but also heavy costs. His most controversial decision was the reversal of traditional alliances in 1756, when France joined its longtime rival, Austria, against Britain and Prussia in the 7 Years' War. That war fought on multiple continents from Europe to North America, and India ended in disaster for France. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 stripped it of most of its overseas empire, including Canada and territories in India, marking a dramatic decline in colonial power and dealing a blow to national pride. At home, Louis XV's reign was marked by opulence and scandal. The king's numerous mistresses, most famously Madame de Pompadour, wielded considerable influence, patronizing the arts, literature, and the emerging philosophical movement of the Enlightenment. Under their encouragement, the royal court became a vibrant center for intellectual and cultural life, with writers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau challenging traditional authority, advocating reason, and spreading ideas that would later help ignite revolution. A monumental work of knowledge edited by Diderot and d'Alembert sought to catalog human understanding and promote secular thought, undermining the unquestioned supremacy of church and crown. These philosophical currents, though celebrated among the elite, clashed with the monarchy's attempts to maintain control over religion, law, and press. The Catholic Church still held enormous sway, and the king's uneasy relationship with the Jesuits, whom he expelled from France in 1764 under pressure from hostile factions, reflected deeper struggles over who would guide the nation's moral and educational life. Meanwhile, the Parliament's high courts of justice grew increasingly assertive, presenting themselves as defenders of the people against royal overreach. Louis XV's attempts to curb their power only increased tensions, painting the monarchy as both overbearing and ineffectual. Economically, the countryside, home to the vast majority of the population, remained burdened by feudal dues, tithes, and heavy taxation, while noble privilege exempted the aristocracy from many of the fiscal burdens. Trade expanded in some areas, and cities like Paris, Bordeaux, and Marseille bustled with commercial activity, but rural poverty and inequality persisted. The disparity between courtly luxury and peasant hardship grew ever more glaring, and stories of Versailles extravagance fueled resentment. By the time Louis XV declared, "Moi, la, after me, the flood," whether in cynicism or resignation, the sense that the monarchy was adrift had become a dangerous undercurrent. When Louis XV died in 1774, the crown passed to his grandson, Louis XVI, a shy, well-meaning, but indecisive ruler. Almost immediately, the young king inherited the tangled web of debt, discontent, and the ideological ferment of Enlightenment thought. His marriage to Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess and daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, was meant to cement the alliance forged in the 7 Years' War. But it also made him vulnerable to public suspicion, so enmity with Austria still lingered in the popular mind. Marie Antoinette's lavish spending, perceived frivolity, and tone-deaf remarks, whether or not she actually said, "Let them eat cake," made her a lightning rod for public anger, especially as the kingdom's finances worsened. Louis XVI tried to implement reforms, appointing ministers like Turgot and later Necker, who sought to liberalize the economy, reduce privileges, and increase transparency in state accounts. But such reforms threatened powerful vested interests among the nobility and clergy, and resistance from these privileged estates often forced the king to retreat. France's involvement in the American Revolutionary War 1775-1783, motivated by a desire to weaken Britain and avenge the 7 Years' War defeat, provided a moral and strategic victory, but further deepened the national debt. French soldiers returning from America brought with them not only stories of liberty, but also concrete examples of Republican ideals in practice. By the late 1780s, the treasury was nearly empty. Harvest failures led to bread shortages, and popular unrest simmered. The Estates General was summoned in 1789 for the first time in over 170 years, intended to solve the fiscal crisis, but instead unleashing a torrent of political energy that the monarchy could not contain. The Third Estate, representing the common people, broke away to form the National Assembly, declaring itself the true voice of the nation. That summer, the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, became the symbolic beginning of the French Revolution. As Paris seethed and the countryside erupted in the Great Fear, centuries of monarchical tradition began to unravel in a matter of months. The year 1789 opened with a restless, electric tension, as if all of France was holding its breath. The Estates General, assembled at Versailles in May, was meant to be a formal, controlled affair. 3 chambers, the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners each, deliberating on the kingdom's financial crisis. But the Third Estate, representing the vast majority of the population yet burdened with the heaviest taxes, quickly realized that voting by order rather than by head would keep them permanently outnumbered. They demanded representation proportional to their numbers, and when their demands were denied, they took a radical step, declaring themselves the National Assembly. In June, they gathered in an indoor tennis court after being locked out of their meeting hall, and swore the now famous tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until they had drafted a constitution. This was not just a procedural protest, it was the visible shattering of the old order, the enceinte that had defined France for centuries. The king wavered between concessions and shows of force, his hesitation further emboldening the revolutionaries. As rumors spread that royal troops were massing to dissolve the assembly, Paris erupted into action. On July 14, 1789, crowds stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison that had come to symbolize arbitrary royal authority. Though the prison held only a handful of inmates, its fall was a thunderclap across Europa. Physical dismantling of tyranny and the spark of a revolutionary fire that would not be easily contained. In the countryside, peasants attacked manor houses, burned feudal records, and seized grain in a wave of uprisings known as the Great Fear. Under this pressure, the National Assembly moved to abolish feudal privileges in early August, tearing down centuries-old hierarchies in a single night. Days later, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity as the new guiding principles of the nation. Louis XVI, still hoping to retain control, reluctantly accepted these changes, but his trust in the revolution was thin. In October 1789, as bread prices soared, thousands of women, many armed with kitchen knives and muskets, from Paris to Versailles, demanding bread and justice. They stormed the palace, confronted the royal family, and forced them to return to Paris under escort, effectively making the king a prisoner of the capital. The court at Versailles was abandoned. The heartbeat of power shifted to the turbulent streets of Paris, where revolutionary clubs, newspapers, and assemblies hummed with new ideas and old grievances. In the years that followed, France's political experiment grew ever more radical. The civil constitution of the clergy in 1790 sought to bring the church under state control, requiring priests to swear loyalty to the nation, a move that split communities and alienated devout Catholics. The king's secret correspondence with foreign monarchs and his growing resistance to the revolution deepened public suspicion. In June 1791, Louis XVI attempted to flee Paris in disguise, aiming to rally loyal troops at the border, but he was recognized and captured in Varennes. His failed escape was a turning point. No longer seen as a father of the nation, he became, in the eyes of many, a traitor. By 1792, the revolution had entered a new, dangerous phase. France declared war on Austria and Prussia, convinced that foreign monarchies conspired to restore the king's absolute power. The war went poorly at first, stoking fears of counter-revolution. In August, Parisian radicals stormed the Tuileries Palace, slaughtering the Swiss guards who defended it and suspending the monarchy. Weeks later, amid panic over invading armies and rumors of royalist plots, mobs broke into prisons and massacred hundreds of suspected enemies of the revolution in the September massacres, acts of violence that horrified moderates but solidified the radicals' grip on the movement. The newly declared French Republic put Louis XVI on trial for treason. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine, followed by Queen Marie Antoinette later that year. Their deaths severed the last symbolic ties to monarchy and sent shockwaves through Europe, where monarchs feared the revolutionary tide might reach their own shores. The revolution, now fully unmoored from its initial constitutional aims, spiraled into the reign of terror under the leadership of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Revolutionary tribunals condemned thousands nobles, clergy, and commoners alike for alleged counter-revolutionary activities. The guillotine became a grim fixture in Paris, its blade falling daily on the Place de la. Yet, even in this atmosphere of fear, the revolution pushed forward sweeping reforms. The metric system was introduced, feudal dues abolished permanently, and lands redistributed. Slavery was abolished in French colonies, though it would be reinstated under Napoleon. And education began to shift toward secular, state-controlled institutions. The calendar itself was remade with new months and weeks of 10 days, an attempt to break entirely from the past. France's armies, driven by revolutionary fervor, began to reverse their fortunes on the battlefield, defeating invading forces and spreading the principles of the revolution beyond its borders. By 1794, however, the revolution was devouring its own leaders. Robespierre, once the architect of the terror, was overthrown and executed by his former allies in July. In the power vacuum that followed, the more moderate Directory took control in 1795, ruling France as a 5-man executive body. The Directory tried to stabilize the nation, but corruption, economic hardship, and ongoing wars left it deeply unpopular. Still, France's military campaigns continued to succeed, bringing glory to a young general whose brilliance on the battlefield was becoming impossible to ignore: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, a Corsican by birth, first gained fame for his role in suppressing a royalist uprising in Paris in 1795, earning him rapid promotion. His Italian campaign in 1796 to 1797 dazzled Europe. defeating Austria's forces and reshaping the political map of northern Italy. Charismatic, strategic, and ambitious, he presented himself as both a servant of the Republic and a man destined for greatness. The Directory, desperate for victories but wary of his rising influence, sent him to Egypt in 1798 to threaten British trade routes. Though the campaign was mixed military success on land, naval disaster at the Battle of the Nilet added to Napoleon's legend and kept him in the public eye. By 1799, the Directory's weaknesses had reached a breaking point. Economic woes persisted, political factions threatened stability, and war continued to drain resources. Sensing the moment, Napoleon returned to France, where he joined a conspiracy to overthrow the government. In November 1799, the coup of 18 Brumaire toppled the Directory, replacing it with a consulate with Napoleon as first consul, a position that gave him near absolute power. The revolution, which had begun with cries for liberty and equality, had come full circle to rest in the hands of a single, extraordinary leader. France, weary from a decade of upheaval, seemed ready to trade the unpredictable chaos of Republican politics for the promise of order under Napoleon. The consulate, established in 1799, was presented as a stabilizing compromise after years of revolutionary turbulence. In reality, it was the stage for Napoleon Bonaparte's rapid and deliberate consolidation of power. As first consul, Napoleon moved with the precision of a general mapping a campaign addressing France's fractured society on multiple fronts. He struck agreements with former royalists, offering amnesty in exchange for loyalty. He soothed the concerns of Catholics through the Concordat of 1801, which restored some privileges to the Church while keeping it under state oversight, ending years of bitter religious division. In the legal realm, he oversaw the creation of the civil code later called the Napoleonic Coda, unified set of laws that abolished feudal privileges, enshrined equality before the law, and standardized property rights, but also reinforced patriarchal authority within families. While he dressed his governance in the language of republicanism, Napoleon was quietly reshaping the state into a personal instrument. The press was censored, dissenting voices stifled, and loyalists installed in key positions. His popularity was genuine, however rooted in a mixture of military glory, economic recovery, and the promise of order after a decade of chaos. In 1802, a plebiscite made him first consul for life. 2 years later, in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony at Notre-Dame Cathedral, taking the crown from the Pope's hands to place it on his own head, a gesture meant to signal that his authority flowed from no earthly superior. Napoleon's empire was as much a product of his restless energy as it was of geopolitical necessity. France, already at war with Britain, soon faced coalitions of European powers Russia. Prussia determined to contain its ambitions. The early years of the Napoleonic Wars were a cascade of victories. At Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon's army executed a masterful maneuver that crushed the combined Austro-Russian forces leading to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine under French influence. Prussia fell swiftly in 1806, its armies shattered at Jena and Austerlitz, and by 1807, after the bloody stalemate of Alo and the decisive win at Friedland, Napoleon had brokered peace with Russia at Tilsit, carving Europe into spheres of influence. But military success was only one arm of his strategy. Napoleon sought to weaken Britain, whose naval supremacy had been affirmed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, by closing continental ports to British goods through the continental system. This economic blockade, announced in Berlin in 1806, aimed to strangle Britain's trade. It was an ambitious move, but it required the cooperation of every European state under French sway. Cracks quickly appeared. Smuggling flourished. Neutral countries resisted, and Britain found new markets overseas. The system hurt continental economies as much as it pressured London. Napoleon's dominion stretched from Spain to the edges of Poland, but holding such an expanse demanded constant vigilance. In Spain, his attempt to install his brother Joseph on the throne in 1808 sparked a brutal guerrilla war. The Peninsular War became a bleeding wound for the empire, drawing in British forces under Wellington and draining men and resources in a conflict that offered few decisive victories. The emperor's personal life, too, intertwined with politics. His marriage to de Beauharnais had been passionate but childless, and in 1810 he divorced her to wed Marie Louise of Austria, niece of the executed Marie Antoinette. This union cemented a fragile peace with Austria and produced a son, Napoleon II, whom he styled the King of Rome. The birth of an heir bolstered the image of a lasting dynasty, but Europe's rulers still watched for the moment to strike. That moment seemed to come in 1812, when Napoleon launched his most ambitious and, ultimately, catastrophic campaign: the invasion of Russia. Officially, it was to enforce the continental system against Russia's defiance. In reality, it was a test of will between two emperors, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I the Grande. A multinational force of over 600,000 men crossed the Niemen River in June, advancing into the vast Russian interior. The Russians refused pitched battle, retreating and burning their own lands to deny the French supplies. When Napoleon finally engaged them at Borodino in September, the battle was indecisive, yet staggeringly bloody. Days later, he entered Moscow only to find it abandoned and set ablaze. Without supplies, and with winter closing in, the French began their retreat in October. Harassed by Russian forces, racked by disease, starvation, and frostbite, the army disintegrated. By the time the survivors recrossed the Niemen, fewer than 100,000 remained. The disaster emboldened Napoleon's enemies. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and others mobilized across Europe. In 1813, Napoleon managed to win at Lutzen and Bautzen. But his forces were stretched thin, his cavalry weakened, and his allies unreliable. At Leipzig, in October, the Battle of the Nations, he suffered a decisive defeat, forcing a retreat into France. By early 1814, Allied armies were on French soil. Napoleon fought a skillful defensive campaign, but could not stem the tide. Paris fell in March, and in April, facing pressure from his marshals, Napoleon abdicated in favor of his son. The Allies refused and restored Louis XVIII to the throne, sending Napoleon into exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba. Yet the story was not over. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba and returned to France in what became known as the 100 Days. His march north to Paris was a political and theatrical triumph. Troops sent to stop him instead joined him, and he entered the capital without firing a shot. Europe, however, was ready. The Seventh Coalition assembled, and in June 1815, Napoleon met his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo, crushed by the forces of Wellington and the Prussian general Blücher. Captured by the British, he was exiled once more, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, surrounded by a handful of loyal followers, Napoleon dictated his memoirs, crafting the legend of his life as a man of destiny, betrayed by fortune and coalitions of mediocrity. He died in 1821 at the age of 51, likely from stomach cancer, though rumors of poisoning persisted. His body would eventually be returned to France in 1840, entombed under the Golden Dome of Les Invalides in Paris, where it remains a site of both reverence and controversy. Napoleon's era left an indelible mark on France and Europe. His legal codes influenced law across the continent. His administrative reforms streamlined governance, and his wars redrew borders and reshaped nations. But his reign also left a legacy of militarism, censorship, and personal rule that haunted France for decades. For the French people, he remained an enigma, both the savior who brought glory and stability after revolution, and the architect of wars that cost millions of lives. The Bourbon monarchy was restored, but the seeds of republicanism, nationalism, and modern governance planted during the Revolution and the Napoleonic years would continue to grow, shaping France's turbulent path through the 19th century. The return of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814 was meant to signal a restoration not just of the crown, but of the old order, a symbolic undoing of the Revolution and the Napoleonic years. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, attempted a cautious balance, granting a constitutional charter that preserved many Napoleonic reforms while restoring noble titles and the Church's influence. Paris was a city both exhausted and restless. Veterans of the Grand lingered in, telling stories of campaigns from Egypt to Moscow, while royalists held court in salons heavy with gilded mirrors and the scent of old privilege. The compromise held uneasily, and Napoleon's dramatic return in the 100 Days underscored how fragile the monarchy's position truly was. After Waterloo, the monarchy was restored again, this time with a sharper edge. The White Terror saw royalist factions taking revenge on Bonapartists and Republicans alike. The reign of Louis XVIII was followed in 1824 by that of his brother. Charles X, whose conservative policies compensating emigrants for lost lands, strengthening the church, curbing the pre-Seleucidated, the growing middle class, and reawakened revolutionary sentiment. France was changing. Industrial workshops were multiplying in Lyon. Coal mines expanded in the north and in Paris. A rising bourgeoisie demanded political influence to match its economic power. In July 1830, the tinderbox ignited. Charles X's attempt to dissolve the legislature and restrict press freedom led to the July Revolution, swift, three-day uprising, remembered as Les Trois Glorieuses. Barricades rose in the narrow streets. Tricolors reappeared from windows, and musket fire cracked through the summer air. Charles fled to England, and the throne passed to Louis Philippe, the citizen king, from the branch of the royal family. His reign, the July monarchy, was presented as a constitutional monarchy for the people, but in truth, it served the interests of the wealthy bourgeoisie. Property qualifications for voting excluded the vast majority of citizens, and political dissent simmered under the surface. The 1830s and 1840s were decades of transformation. Railways began to crisscross the landscape, carrying coal, textiles, and passengers faster than any horse-drawn coach could. Urban populations swelled. Paris's working-class districts teemed with laborers, artisans, and impoverished migrants from the countryside. Social tensions deepened, and radical thinkers, Republicans, socialists, utopians, debated the future in pamphlets and underground meetings. In 1834, silk workers in Lyon staged the Cannet revolts, protesting wage cuts. The army crushed them, but the unrest was a harbinger of what lay ahead. Abroad, France sought to restore its prestige through colonial ventures. In 1830, French troops invaded Algeria, beginning a brutal and protracted conquest that would last decades and deeply shape both nations. The campaign became a testing ground for officers and a source of national pride for some, even as critics condemned its human and financial costs. By the late 1840s, economic downturns, poor harvests, and political exclusion converged into a new revolutionary wave. In February 1848, demonstrations in Paris swelled into mass protests. Barricades reappeared, and the National Guard refused to suppress the crowds. Louis Philippe abdicated and fled to England, and the Second Republic was proclaimed. For the first time, universal male suffrage was introduced, an enormous leap from the restrictive voting system of the July monarchy. The Republic, however, faced immediate challenges. The June Days Uprising of 1848 saw workers in Paris rise against the closure of national workshops, a public employment scheme. The revolt was brutally suppressed, deepening divisions between the working class and the bourgeois Republican leadership. Amid the turbulence, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of Napoleon I, was elected president by a landslide, his name evoking both stability and national glory. Louis's presidency revealed a keen political instinct. He championed economic modernization, railways, banks, and industrial growth while also courting conservative rural voters. But the Constitution barred him from seeking re-election in 1852. In December 1851, he staged a coup d'état, dissolving the National Assembly and appealing directly to the people in a plebiscite. The following year, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, inaugurating the Second Empire. The Second Empire was a paradoxical regime that combined authoritarian rule with dynamic modernization. Napoleon III tightened press control and restricted political freedoms. Yet he presided over an economic boom. Paris was transformed under Baron Haussmann, its tangled medieval alleys replaced by wide boulevards, grand parks, and uniform stone facades. The redesign not only beautified the city, but also made it easier to control. Uprisings, barricades, were harder to erect on broad avenues. Industry flourished, foreign trade expanded, and France's rail network became one of the densest in Europe. The empire also pursued ambitious foreign policy. In the 1850s, France fought alongside Britain and the Ottoman Empire in the Crimean War against Russia, emerging with enhanced prestige. Napoleon III sought to expand French influence, globally intervening in Italy to support its unification, though later clashing with the Papal States, establishing a presence in Indochina, and disastrously intervening in Mexico to place Maximilian of Austria on the throne, a venture that ended in failure and execution. By the 1860s, the empire began to liberalize under public pressure. Censorship eased. The legislature gained more power, and opposition groups, monarchists, socialists, tested the boundaries of expression. Yet challenges mounted. The economy faltered toward the decade's end, and France's diplomatic position weakened. The decisive blow came in 1870, when tensions with Prussia escalated over the candidacy of a Hohenzollern prince to the Spanish throne. Bismarck, master of political manipulation, published the Ems Dispatch, inflaming French public opinion. Napoleon III, ill and miscalculating, declared war on Prussia. The Franco-Prussian War was a swift and devastating defeat. The French army suffered crushing losses at Sedan in September 1870, where Napoleon III was captured. Paris, under siege, endured months of bombardment and starvation before surrendering in January 1871. In the war's aftermath, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Deliberate humiliation, and France ceded Alsace and part of Lorraine to Germany. The defeat brought down the Second Empire and birthed the Third Republic amid chaos. In March 1871, Paris erupted again. This time, in the radical experiment of the Paris Commune, self-governing socialist city that sought to implement progressive reforms, workers' rights, secular education, and cooperative ownership. For 2 months, the Commune stood as both inspiration and threat, until the French army, loyal to the conservative government in Versailles, stormed the city in La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, killing thousands. Yet, Despite its bloody birth, the Third Republic endured. It would become France's longest-lasting regime since the Revolution. Navigating colonial expansion, industrial growth, and political scandals. But the memory of lost provinces, of humiliation at German hands, and of class warfare in the streets of Paris would linger, shaping national identity and foreign policy well into the 20th century. The decades following the brutal suppression of the Paris Commune settled into a period of uneasy stability for the Third Republic. The political system was fragile. Monarchists still hoped for restoration. Republicans argued over the extent of reform, and socialists pushed for deeper change, but the institutions slowly took root. A commitment to secular education under Jules Ferry's laws in the 1880s, which removed religious orders from teaching, signaled the Republic's determination to separate church and state. In the classrooms of rural villages and urban neighborhoods alike, children learned not only to read and write, but also to see themselves as citizens of a united France. Economically, the late 19th century saw recovery and transformation. Railways stitched together the regions from the wheat fields of the Beauce to the vineyards of Bordeaux, the coal mines of the north to the bustling port of Marseille. Industry expanded, and Paris, with its wide boulevards and bright, became the beating heart of the Belle Époque period, remembered for its cultural flourishing and optimism. Electric street lamps bathed the city in a soft glow. The Eiffel Tower rose above the skyline in 1889 as both marvel and controversy. And the newly opened rumbled beneath the cobblestones. The air was filled with the scent of roasted chestnuts, the chatter of boulevard, and the strains of music from the Garnier. The Belle Époque was also an era of scientific discovery and artistic innovation. The Impressionist Monet, Renoir, Degas captured fleeting light on canvas, while Rodin sculpted emotion into marble. Writers like Émile Zola and Guy de Maupassant delved into the lives of workers, peasants, and the bourgeoisie, offering vivid portraits of modern life. In laboratories, Marie and Pierre Curie isolated radium, and Louis Pasteur's germ theory revolutionized medicine, bringing safer milk, vaccines, and public health reforms. These advances gave the period a sense of boundless possibility. Yet beneath the surface of this golden glow, tensions persisted. The colonial expansion that fueled French pride also reflected brutal realities abroad. France's empire extended across North and West Africa, Senegal, Mali, Algeria, Tunisia, Madagascar, as well as into Indochina and the Pacific. The conquest of these territories involved military campaigns, forced labor, and cultural suppression, justified at home under the rhetoric of a civilizing mission. Colonial exhibitions in Paris displayed exoticized versions of conquered peoples, shaping public imagination, but masking the human costs of empire. At home, political scandals periodically shook the Republic's confidence. The most infamous was the Dreyfus affair, beginning in 1894, when Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer, was falsely accused of selling military secrets to Germany. Convicted on flimsy evidence and sent to Devil's Island, Dreyfus became the center of a national crisis. Intellectuals like Émile Zola, who published his open letter, J'accuse, exposed the miscarriage of justice and the deep veins of anti-Semitism in French society. The affair split the country into Dreyfusers and anti-Dreyfusers, testing the Republic's ideals of equality and due process. After years of public struggle, Dreyfus was exonerated, but the scars of division remained. The turn of the century brought rapid modernization alongside rising nationalism. Advances in aviation with pioneers like Ader and in automobiles from Peugeot and Renault suggested a future of speed and innovation. Paris hosted the 1900 Exposition Universelle, celebrating technology and global culture under the graceful arches of the Grand Palais. But the same modernization was sharpening rivalries among Europe's great powers. The Franco-Prussian alliance, formed in 1894, is part of a web of alliances intended to balance Germany's growing might. The memory of the 1870 defeat to Prussia still burned, particularly over Alsace-Lorraine, which remained under German control. Military planners rearmed and fortified the eastern frontier, while nationalist newspapers stirred public opinion with stories of German aggression. Meanwhile, colonial competition brought France into occasional conflict with Britain and Germany, such as the Fashoda incident in Sudan, 1898, and the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, where Germany tested French resolve over North Africa. Social changes also accelerated. Urbanization continued to pull people from the countryside into cities, creating both opportunities and overcrowding. Labor unions grew stronger, demanding better wages and conditions. Strikes became common, from dockworkers in Marseille to miners in the Pas-de-Calais. Socialist leaders like Jean emerged, advocating not only for workers' rights but also for peace in an increasingly militarized Europe. His eloquence in Parliament and the press made him one of France's most respected voices, though his pacifism would place him in the crosshairs of history. Culturally, the arts pushed further into modernism. Picasso arrived in Paris, absorbing and reshaping influences that would birth Cubism. The cabarets of Montmartre, from the Moulin Rouge to Le Chat Noir, buzzed with music, satire, and the daring performances of the Belle Epoque nightlife. Cinematic pioneers like the brothers and Georges Méliès introduced audiences to moving pictures, turning Paris into one of the world's first cinematic capitals. By 1914, France stood as a confident, modern nation, industrialized, culturally vibrant, and backed by a vast colonial empire. Yet the alliances, military buildup, and nationalist fervor of the early 20th century created a fragile peace. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo set in motion the alliances that would plunge Europe into war. For France, the call to arms was more than an obligation. It was seen by many as a chance to settle the score of 1870, to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, and to defend the Republic's honor. In the summer heat of 1914, mobilization orders spread through towns and cities. Men in blue uniforms and red trousers marched to the train stations, cheered by crowds waving tricolor flags. Women watched with mixed pride and dread, their lives about to be upended. On the eve of the First World War, the optimism of the Belle Epoque was already fading, replaced by the uncertainty of a conflict whose scale no one yet imagined. The summer of 1914 in France began in warmth and sunlight, with markets bustling, full, and children playing under the long evenings. Posters appeared on walls, summoning men to arms. In Paris, the sound of carriage wheels and electric trams mixed with the tramp of boots as soldiers in red trousers and blue coats marched toward the train stations, their rifles slung and bayonets glinting. Families crowded platforms, waving handkerchiefs and shouting last words, while the locomotives hissed steam that rose into the August sky. At first, there was confident belief that the war would be over by Christmas, that France, united and determined, would deliver swift retribution for 1817. The Plan 17 strategy called for a bold offensive into Alsace-Lorraine, the provinces taken by Germany 4 decades earlier. But optimism met grim reality almost immediately. German forces, executing the Schlieffen Plan, swept through neutral Belgium and into northern France, their artillery and machine guns cutting down the colorful French uniforms with horrifying efficiency. The Battle of the Frontiers in August 1914 brought staggering casualties. Entire regiments were shattered within days. Paris itself seemed threatened as German armies advanced toward the Marne River. The city braced for siege. Government officials evacuated to Bordeaux. Then, in early September, the French army, with British support, launched a desperate counterattack, the First Battle of the Marne. In a scene that became legend, Parisian taxi drivers ferried thousands of soldiers to the front. The battle halted the German advance, forcing them to retreat and dig defensive positions. Soon, both sides were entrenched from the North Sea to Switzerland, locked in a stalemate that would define the next 4 years. Life in the trenches was a waking nightmare. Soldiers, the poilus, literally the hairy ones for their beards and unshaven faces, lived in narrow ditches carved into the earth, the walls shored with sandbags and timber. Mud clung to everything, swallowing boots and seeping into uniforms. Rats grew fat on spilled rations and grimly on the dead. The smell of damp earth mingled with gunpowder, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present scent of death. Letters from home were treasured, read and reread under dim candlelight, a reminder of a life that seemed impossibly distant. Battles became grinding slaughters. Verdun in 1916 was the longest and one of the bloodiest battles in history. For 10 months, French and German forces fought over a few square kilometers of ruined forts and hills. "I les ne passeront pas," "they shall not pass," became the rallying cry, embodied by General S. determination to hold at all costs. Verdun claimed over 300,000 lives, French and German alike. and left the landscape a moonscape of craters and shattered trees. The Somme, that same year, fought primarily by the British with French support, added even more to the toll. Yet amidst the devastation, life and resilience persisted. In Paris, though food was rationed and air raids occasionally darkened the skies, the city tried to keep its heart beating. Theaters staged plays, stayed open, and women took on roles in factories, transportation, and offices, filling the absence of men at the front. This new visibility of women in the workforce began to shift social norms, planting seeds for future change. The war also drew heavily on France's empire. Colonial troops from Senegal, Morocco, Algeria, Indochina, and Madagascar served on the Western Front, enduring the same brutal conditions as their French comrades. They brought with them different languages, foods, and cultural traditions, a reminder that the war was truly global. Many would return home with altered views of France, having fought and bled for a nation that did not always grant them equal respect. Technology reshaped the battlefield. Artillery barrages pulverized ground and men alike. Poison gas clouds drifted over no man's land, burning lungs and eyes. Airplanes, once used only for reconnaissance, began dogfights above the trenches and dropped small bombs. Tanks, though primitive, rumbled into use by 1917, breaking through some entrenched positions. The war became a machine of attrition, grinding down nations in blood and steel. By 1917, exhaustion and disillusionment spread. Mutinies erupted in parts of the French army after failed offensives, like the Naval Offensive, where promises of a breakthrough dissolved into more slaughter. Soldiers refused to launch new attacks, though they still defended their positions. General, now Commander-in-Chief, restored order not with mass executions, but with improvements to rest rotations, leave policies, and supplies. Meanwhile, the United States entered the war in April 1917, bringing fresh troops and resources. This new energy would prove decisive. In 1918, the Germans launched a massive spring offensive, hoping to end the war before American forces could fully deploy. They advanced dangerously close to Paris again, but were stopped in the Second Battle of the Marne. The Allies, reinforced and reorganized, counterattacked in the 100 Days Offensive, pushing the exhausted German army back. On November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent. The armistice had been signed in a railway carriage. In bells rang across France. Strangers embraced in the streets. Tears flowed for joy and grief alike. France had survived, but at a staggering cost. 1.4 million dead. Millions more wounded, countless villages destroyed, farmland cratered, and a generation scarred. The victory brought Alsace-Lorraine back into France's fold. A moment of long-awaited closure from the humiliation of 1871. Yet the peace that followed in the Treaty of Versailles was fragile. While it imposed heavy reparations on Germany, it also sowed the seeds of future conflict. For now, however, France mourned, rebuilt. and try to believe in a return to normalcy after 4 years in the shadow of death. The 1920s in France began in a strange blend of exhaustion and exuberance. Paris glittered as the city of light again, drawing artists, writers, and musicians from around the world. Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein filled Left Bank with talk of literature and modernism. Josephine Baker, the American-born dancer, brought an exotic, electric energy to the stage, while the surrealists, Breton, and others reshaped the boundaries of art. Yet beneath this cultural bloom lay the wounds of war. Villages still in ruins. Men with empty sleeves or haunted eyes. Families forever missing a son, a father, a brother. The government, under the Third Republic, tried to navigate between honoring the sacrifices of the great war and addressing the social and economic shifts it had unleashed. Women, who had proved essential to the wartime economy, were still denied the vote, though their public roles continued to expand. France fortified its eastern border with the Maginot Line, a string of modern fortifications meant to prevent another German invasion. The nation invested heavily in defense, but its faith lay in a strategy of protection and waiting, not in lightning offense. Germany, meanwhile, reeled under the Treaty of Versailles restrictions. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s saw German banknotes printed in the billions, their value collapsing daily. This chaos, combined with political instability and resentment over perceived humiliation, created fertile ground for radical movements. The 1929 Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through the global economy, and France was not spared. Unemployment rose, strikes grew more frequent, and political divisions deepened. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany in 1933. Their rhetoric was openly revisionist, rejecting Versailles, demanding the return of lost territories, and stoking nationalist fervor. France watched warily, remembering the unhealed scars of 1914 to 1918. Diplomatic efforts alliances with Eastern European states, treaties with Britain sought to contain German ambitions. But the mood in France remained cautious. Many still clung to the hope that peace could be preserved through negotiation. By the mid-1930s, events began to erode that hope. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, a direct violation of Versailles. France, politically fractured between left and right, hesitated to act. At home, the Popular Front, a coalition of leftist parties, briefly held power, passing reforms like the 40-hour work week and paid vacations measures celebrated by workers but criticized by conservatives as destabilizing. Across the Rhine, Hitler's rearmament accelerated and anti-Semitic policies deepened. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, added to the tension. France's government officially stayed neutral, though French volunteers joined the fight against Franco's fascists in the international brigades. The war became a testing ground for German and Italian military power, while France wrestled with whether fascism would soon reach its own borders. The turning point came with Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938 and the crisis over Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland. At the Munich conference in September that year, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier agreed to let Hitler take the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of no further expansion, a decision later condemned as appeasement. Daladier returned to France expecting outrage, but was met instead by relieved crowds who believed war had been avoided. Yet, within months, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, exposing the emptiness of his promises. In March 1939, Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia convinced France and Britain to guarantee Poland's independence. When Hitler's forces invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, those guarantees were called in. On September 3rd, France and Britain declared war on Germany. The months that followed became known as the Dreux de Gare, or Phony War. French troops manned the Maginot Line. British forces arrived to join them. Yet, no major offensives were launched. Life in Paris, carried on with an uneasy normalcy, stayed open. Theaters staged performances, but blackout curtains were drawn at night. And air raid drills reminded citizens that the storm had only been delayed. In May 1940, the storm broke. German forces bypassed the Maginot Line by sweeping through Belgium and the Ardennes forest range. The French had believed impassable for large armies. This blitzkrieg, or lightning war, combined fast-moving tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support, overwhelming defenses before they could regroup. The French and British forces were driven back. The British evacuated at Dunkirk in a massive naval rescue, leaving much of their equipment behind. By June, German troops were advancing toward Paris. The French government fled to Bordeaux, and the city was declared an open city to avoid destruction. On June 14, 1940, German forces marched into Paris, their boots echoing on the cobblestones of the Champs. Days later, France signed an armistice with Germany in the same railway carriage. At where Germany had signed the 1918 armistice saw deliberate act of humiliation. France was divided into two zones, the German-occupied north and the so-called Free Zone in the south. Governed from Vichy under Marshal Philippe, the Vichy regime collaborated with the Nazis, implementing anti-Jewish laws and aiding in deportations. Resistance began almost immediately. Networks of ordinary citizens, soldiers, and political activists who sabotaged rail lines, printed underground newspapers, and guided Allied pilots to safety. From London, General Charles de Gaulle broadcast messages urging the French to fight on, declaring that France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. This occupation would become the next chapter, one that would test the very soul of the nation. The German occupation of France brought with it a quiet, heavy shadow. Streets that had once been alive with chatter, music, and the aroma of fresh bread were now lined with Nazi flags and patrolled by soldiers speaking a foreign tongue. In conversations dropped to whispers when uniforms passed by. The sound of hobnailed boots on cobblestones became a daily rhythm, accompanied by the uneasy silence of a people holding back their thoughts. Food grew scarce. Butter, sugar, coffee, and meat were rationed. Long queues formed outside bakeries. The black market thrived in shadowed alleys. The Vichy government in the south, though officially autonomous, quickly aligned itself with German policies. Led by Marshall, a hero of World War I, it embraced the slogan Travail, Famille, Patrie work, family, fatherland, and dismantled much of the democratic structure of the Third Republic. Soon, arrests and deportations followed. Trains left French soil for camps in the East. Names like Drancy, Pithiviers, and Bonne-la-Rolande became stepping stones to Auschwitz. Many French citizens, collaborators, and informants aided in these arrests. Others risked their lives to hide and protect their Jewish neighbors, creating a moral divide that would haunt France for decades after the war. Yet from the beginning, resistance pulsed beneath the surface. It was fragmented at first, small groups of students distributing leaflets, farmers hiding weapons in haylofts, railway workers sabotaging trains. In Lyon, Jean Moulin worked tirelessly to unite these factions into a cohesive movement. In Paris, the clandestine newspaper Combat circulated under the noses of the Gestapo. Maquisards ruled guerrilla fighters, and mountains, cutting communication lines and ambushing convoys. Messages were passed in coded radio broadcasts from London, the long sobs of the violins of autumn, phrases that signaled the time for action. Meanwhile, in exile, Charles de Gaulle emerged as the face of free France. From his London headquarters, he addressed the nation via BBC broadcasts, urging unity and defiance. His speeches carried across the channel, reaching hidden radios in kitchens and barns. To some, he was the symbol of hope. To others, a distant voice. But as the war dragged on, his influence grew. Free French forces joined the Allies in North Africa, fighting alongside British and American troops in campaigns that began to turn the tide. By 1944, after the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th, D-Day, liberation of France, was underway. The beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword erupted in chaos and courage. Soldiers wading through cold surf under machine gun fire. Medics dragging the wounded to safety. Ships bombarding German positions from offshore. Behind the front lines, the French resistance rose in open rebellion, sabotaging German supply lines, seizing town halls, and clashing with occupying forces in street battles. Paris, though not part of the initial invasion plan, became a flashpoint in August. Strikes crippled German communications. Barricades went up in the streets. The tricolor flag reappeared on balconies. On August 25th, Free French forces under General Philippe Leclerc entered the city to jubilant crowds. De Gaulle marched down the Champs. The following day, in a moment captured in photographs that would define the liberation, his tall frame cutting through the crowd. The air electric with relief and pride. The liberation, however, was not the end of France's wartime story. The months that followed brought reckonings. Trials were held for collaborators. Some, like Pierre Laval, were executed. Others, including Marshall, were sentenced to life imprisonment. Women accused of collaboration, sometimes for nothing more than relationships with German soldiers, were publicly humiliated, their heads shaved in town squares. The resistance, once united against a common enemy, fractured along political lines as the future of post-war France took shape. Yet, in the glow of freedom, there was also a renewed sense of purpose. Gaul formed a provisional government determined to restore France's place on the world stage. Paris was again alive, though scarred. Its monuments had survived, but its people carried memories of occupation that would never fade. The war had left deep wounds, but also a belief hard-earned and fragile that France could rise again from its darkest hours. When the guns fell silent in 1945, France stood free, yet deeply shaken. Cities bore scars rubble where buildings once stood, bridges rebuilt from twisted steel, homes pockmarked with bullet holes. But more than stone had been fractured. Trust itself had been strained. Old alliances and friendships, torn by war and collaboration, had to be rebuilt with patience. Into this landscape stepped Charles de Gaulle, the soldier-statesman whose voice had carried across occupied airwaves. In 1946, he resigned abruptly from the provisional government, frustrated by political infighting, only to return over a decade later to reshape France's destiny. The Fourth Republic, 1946 to 1958, emerged from the ashes, built on parliamentary democracy, but it was plagued by instability. Cabinets rose and fell with dizzying speed, over 20 governments in 12 years each, struggling to address economic recovery. The cost of war and the shadow of empire. For France's colonial holdings were stirring with unrest. In Indochina, the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, began as French forces clashed with the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh. The defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 was more than a military loss. It signaled the waning of French colonial dominance in Asia. That same year, the Geneva Accords ended French presence in Indochina, setting the stage for the Vietnam War. But even as one empire faded, another crisis erupted in North Africa. Algeria, considered by many in France not as a colony, but as part of France itself, became the heart of a bitter and brutal war for independence. 1962. It was not fought on distant battlefields. Alone violence spilled into the streets of Paris, where police crackdowns on pro-independence demonstrations in 1961 led to the deaths of dozens, their bodies thrown into the Seine. Torture, disappearances, and bombings left deep moral wounds. The conflict split France politically and socially, contributing to the collapse of the Fourth Republic. In 1958, amid the Algerian crisis, de Gaulle returned to power, founding the Fifth Republic with a strong presidency. His vision for France was one of grandeur and independence. He sought to free the nation from over-reliance on either the United States or the Soviet Union, developing France's own nuclear deterrent, the force de frappe, and withdrawing from NATO's integrated military command in 1966, while still remaining a member. In the streets, his leadership inspired pride. Abroad, it projected an image of a France determined to chart its own path in the Cold War world. Economically, the post-war decades became known as Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, 1945 to 1975, of rapid growth. French factories, fueled by Marshall Plan aid and technological modernization, hummed with productivity. The countryside changed as mechanized farming reduced the need for agricultural labor, sending waves of rural families to urban centers. Paris expanded outward. Modernist apartment blocks rose, and new industrial hubs formed. Consumer culture blossomed. Cars, televisions, and household appliances became symbols of progress. Yet this transformation also brought tensions between the traditional rhythms of rural life and the dizzying pace of modernity. Culturally, France retained its aura as a center of art, literature, and philosophy. In Left Bank, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir debated existentialism, while in cinemas, the Nouvelle Vague New Wave redefined film, with directors like François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard breaking conventions in style and narrative. Chanson singers such as Edith Piaf and Jacques Brel gave voice to love, loss, and longing in melodies that floated from radios into courtyards and kitchens. Yet the Cold War brought its share of internal strains. In May 1968, a wave of protests swept across France, sparked by student unrest at the University of Nanterre. Demonstrations spread to the Sorbonne in Paris, where cobblestone barricades and graffiti slogans called for liberation, not only from capitalism, but from traditional social norms. Workers joined the movement, leading to a massive general strike that paralyzed the country. For a moment, it seemed as though revolution might be reborn on French soil. De Gaulle's authority wavered, but ultimately he weathered the crisis, though his resignation followed a year later. The 1970s and 1980s brought new challenges. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 ended the economic boom, ushering in inflation, unemployment, and social discontent. France's shifting demographics, influenced by immigration from former colonies in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, added new layers to its cultural fabric, enriching cuisine, music, and language, but also sparking debates over integration and identity. In 1981, François Mitterrand of the Socialist Party became president, ushering in an era of ambitious reforms: abolition of the death penalty, expansion of social welfare programs, nationalization of key industries. His presidency also saw the construction of grand architectural projects. The grands projets, including the glass pyramid at the Louvre, and the Grande Arch add modern monuments to a nation that continually redefined itself. Yet, even as France thrived in certain spheres, the Cold War's global tensions cast their long shadow. France remained a firm advocate for European integration, helping to shape what would become the European Union. The country also played a role in diplomatic efforts between East and West, sometimes acting as an intermediary. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, ending the Cold War era, France stood as one of the pillars of a reshaped Europe, confident, complex, and forever balancing the echoes of its past with the ambitions of its future. The Cold War's end in 1991 left France in a world no longer divided by an iron curtain, but still full of shifting alliances, fragile peace, and new challenges. The streets of Paris bustled with optimism in those early years, European borders softening, a trade flowing, a shared currency on the horizon. France became one of the driving forces behind the creation of the euro, launched in 1999, replacing the franc that had jingled in pockets for centuries. It was a leap of faith in a more united Europe. And yet, even then, debates simmered about sovereignty, national identity, and economic control. The 1990s were also a time of cultural and technological transformation. High-speed TGV trains stitched the country together, their sleek silver bodies flashing across landscapes of vineyards, sunflower fields, and medieval towns. The internet arrived, first hesitantly, then all at once. That once hummed with the sound of clinking coffee cups began to host glowing screens and hushed, curious clicks. French cinema, music, and literature entered new phases, blending tradition with experimentation. Directors like Jean-Pierre Jeunet brought whimsical surrealism to the screen, while fashion houses like Chanel, Dior, and Yves Saint Laurent reimagined luxury for a new century. Politically, France navigated turbulent waters. François Mitterrand's final years in office were marked by both diplomatic achievements and domestic controversies. In 1995, Jacques Chirac became president, promising to heal divisions and modernize the economy. His tenure brought moments of national unity such as France's victory in the 1998 FIFA World Cup, when the chant "Black, Blank, Burr" celebrated a multicultural team that seemed to embody France's ideals. The streets erupted in joyous parades, flags waving from balconies, horns echoing into the warm summer night. Yet, challenges persisted. Strikes over pension reforms, debates about immigration policy, and concerns about France's role in the European Union all bubbled beneath the surface. The attacks of September 11th, 2001 in the United States altered global politics, and France found itself balancing cooperation in counterterrorism with an independent stance on foreign policy. In 2003, Chirac opposed the US-led invasion of Iraq, a move that was met with both praise at home and tension abroad, cementing France's reputation for pursuing its own diplomatic path. The 2000s also saw the European Union expand eastward, bringing new member states and fresh debates about integration. At home, cities evolved, Las glass towers multiplied. While in historic neighborhoods like Montmartre, the hum of tourism blended with the quiet persistence of daily Parisian life. High-speed rail links extended beyond France's borders, and the Airbus A380, part of a European collaboration, soared from French factories into the skies. In 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy became president, promising economic reform and a break from political stagnation. His tenure was marked by a more personal, media-savvy style, and also by the 2008 global financial crisis, which strained economies across Europe. France responded with stimulus measures, and like many nations, faced slow recovery. Social tensions grew as unemployment lingered, particularly among youth and immigrant communities. By 2012, the pendulum swung again. François Hollande, a socialist, took office amid promises of fairness and growth. His presidency would be shaped by both economic struggles and tragedy. In January 2015, gunmen attacked the offices of Charlie Hebdo, killing 12, and later that year, coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris on November 13th claimed 130 lives. The City of Light, so often a symbol of romance and art, became a place of mourning, candles flickering beside flowers at makeshift memorials. Yet the response of thousands gathering in unity marches. The words, Nous sommes unis, spoke to France's resilience. The second decade of the 21st century brought both challenges and moments of renewal. Paris hosted the COP21 climate conference in 2015, leading to the Paris Agreement, a landmark global accord on climate change. Culturally, French cuisine continued to inspire the world, with chefs balancing tradition and innovation, while the Louvre, the d'Orsay, and the Centre Pompidou drew millions each year. Beyond Paris, cities like Lyon, Bordeaux, and Marseille thrived as cultural and economic centers, each with its own rhythm and flavor. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron, a centrist and former economy minister, won the presidency, defeating far-right candidate Marine Le Pen. At 39, he became the youngest president in French history, promising a blend of progressive reforms and economic liberalization. His tenure, however, was soon tested. The Gilets jaunes yellow vest protests erupted in 2018, sparked by a fuel tax, but quickly growing into a wider movement against inequality and the perceived disconnect between urban elites and rural citizens. Demonstrations swept through French cities, at times peaceful, at times clashing with police beneath clouds of tear gas. France also continued to navigate its role in an increasingly complex Europe. Brexit reshaped EU politics, and Macron positioned France as a key voice for deeper integration and collective defense. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 brought quiet streets and shuddered, as lockdowns tested the endurance of daily life. The pandemic also underscored the importance of France's healthcare system, social safety nets, and a cultural cohesion. In recent years, France has faced renewed debates about secularism, immigration, and the balance between liberty and security. Terror attacks, though less frequent than in the mid-2010s, have kept security high on the agenda. At the same time, the country has embraced large-scale renewable energy projects, modernization of infrastructure, and preparations for major cultural events such as the 2024 Paris Olympics. By 2025, France stands as a nation of contrasts, steeply rooted in history, yet constantly reinventing itself. Its villages still host weekly markets where the smell of fresh baguettes mingles with the sharp tang of cheese, while its cities pulse with electric scooters, tech startups, and global fashion shows. Cathedrals ring their bells as TGVs glide silently across the countryside. The Seine reflects both centuries-old bridges and the gleam of modern architecture. And through it all, France moves forward, sometimes cautiously, sometimes boldly carrying the weight of its past, not as a tapestry of memory, each thread essential to the whole. In the hush of an evening cafe, with the aroma of espresso curling in the air, one can still feel the same blend of intellect, artistry, and quiet determination that has guided France from the days of Gaul to the present moment.